is perhaps a little longer, and then there'll be the usual opportunity for questions and contributions. So over to you, Lars.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So the title of this is Stalin, the father of the British road to socialism, the CPGB's program, which was first launched in 1951. Actually, probably in a British context, uncle would have been the better word for that, given that during, this is kind of lost now and forgotten by history really, but Stalin was an enormously popular figure in Britain during the Second World War, because he was the generalissimo leading the Red Army to victory. Britain was in alliance with the Soviet Union, and therefore it wasn't just a working class kind of cult. It was also a cult propagated by the BBC. The BBC used to, from 1939, 1940, when they put fucking Oh Finlandia on the BBC airwaves. By 1941, by the time of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, this had been transported over into very much pro kind of Russian propaganda. But Stalin was genuinely popular, and the Red Army were genuinely popular. That began to change, particularly when British soldiers of left inclinations, if you read the novels of Alexander Barrow, who'd been in the YCL, when left-leaning soldiers came face to face or began to hear about what the Red Army had actually done in Germany during the occupation, some of the image began to be tarnished somewhat. But of course, then we have the Cold War, and this is the period I'm gonna mostly talk about, is this 45 to 1950 period, when Stalin suddenly becomes the leader of the enemy again. But there's no kind of real doubt that, as I say, Stalin was a popular figure, and the Red Army figure. Even you can still find there's still a few estates in Britain have still got Stalin Way, in the same way that they've got Roosevelt Way and Churchill Way. There's still that kind of memory, and also as well, the CP itself became much more popular than it had been previously. It had a massive influx of membership in 1942. It grew to about 60,000 on paper kind of members. And also as well, the actual influence of that and the popular recognition for the Soviet Union spread to some very rural parts of Britain as well. I've been recently, for my sins, doing a local history project about the town near where I grew up, Banbury, which had a big metal casting factory in the the alley where my grandfather worked as his job. During the Second World War, that had a huge influx of labour from all over parts of Britain, and the politics of the labour movement came with it. And suddenly, much to my amazement, in the Banbury Guardian and the Banbury Advertiser, you see all the Communist Party's meetings, massive YCL socials. I couldn't believe it. There's a small village near Banbury that's up just over the Northants border. Banbury's in the north part of Oxfordshire. In Woodford House, which is a little village just over in the Northants border, they had the biggest YCL in the South Midlands district, and they had bike rides. They were called the Woodford House Wheelers, Red Wheelers of Woodford House, and they had bike rides where 300 kids would go along. So this has suddenly become, and the reason why that growth is mostly due to the popularity of the Soviets as a kind of war ally. And so and it's quite strange. There's a novelist called Hubert Nicholson. He wrote a book called Here Where the World is Quiet. Hubert Nicholson went to work in Banbury in the aluminium casting factory that my grand worked in. Obviously, my grand didn't work in it till post the Second World War. But that whole novel, although he says it's not about Banbury, but it obviously is, because it starts with a strike in a metal casting factory, so it's fairly obvious by some of the descriptions that what's going on. But yeah, what's interesting to me is in that market town is how the politics of the Soviet Union and come into like a small market town. But that to some degree, with a lot of unevenness, was true all over Britain. Basically the Communist Party grew. It was still nothing compared to the Labour Party, and it was still unpopular. It wasn't really, you know, but in its own terms, it was popular. So this is some of the kind of, I don't have time to go into all that, but this is some of the background of this kind of period, really. Moving on to the actual British road to socialism itself, there's no doubt anymore. There was never much doubt, I don't think, but there was always some people who questioned it. There's no doubt that the Russians, the CPSU and the Stalin had a big influence on the genesis of the British road to socialism. Just to explain the nub of the British road to socialism, basically what it is, and this is very much of in a nutshell kind of definition of it. The nub of the British road to socialism is that socialism will be initiated by a Labour government of a new type. And that Labour government of a new type would be a left-wing Labour administration, but it will be one that will be helped and advised by a kind of phalanx of CPGB MPs. And when I say MPs, this was a parliamentary road to socialism, a peaceful road to socialism, and it envisaged using the so-called democratic institutions of the British state to realise, to initiate the steps towards socialism. And then you have this image of, you know, a whole succession of Labour governments that will steadily be tacking to the left. This was a utopian fantasy, as we kind of know from we've kind of seen some of it in the Corbyn movement, which I'm not going to go into in detail. It's a utopian fantasy because it uses the Labour Party as a vehicle to achieve socialism. Well, the Labour Party, the Labour left, as we know, is tied to the Labour right, and the Labour right is tied to the British state. So the whole idea of this is in general terms, it's utopian and it's a fantasy, and I'll be very surprised if that's the way we reach socialism. However, the period I'm going to talk about, you could kind of see what people could perhaps be fooled by that utopian fantasy. I'm just going to briefly run through, just in case anybody doubts that Stalin had a series of meetings with Harry Pollitt, the General Secretary of the CPGB, in 1950 to 1951. And you can find those there on the Marxist.org site, and you can download. They're ready and available. You just have to do a basic web search. But it was a scholar called Vijay Singh who actually uncovered the documents. I think it was in about 2008 that he did this or published this, and he published it in Vijay Singh, I think, I don't want to talk for the comrade, but he's actually a comrade, I suppose I would describe as a Stalinist. Yeah, no, he wasn't a Trotskyist, he wasn't engaged on some one-man mission to undermine the communist movement. So yeah, but these sit in the Russian state archives. You can access some of the Russian state archives online. I think these are in the closed part that's not. And these came to light, and they kind of proved what we always kind of knew. But it's not just those documents which are a full set of meetings. They're all minuted, and all the back and forth is in them, and they clearly show Stalin's clear interest and his sponsorship of this program, this idea of the British road to socialism that I've laid out for you. But also there's other evidence as well. Pravda splashed it all over its newspaper, and if you're bored enough, you can find an article on my blog where I've sketched that out. I've translated it, some of it with the help of AI and people who can speak Russian. And basically what it is in Pravda, there's no editorializing from the CPSU on it. It was reproduced in 1951, but it's just basically just reproduced. It's just the whole bloody thing of the BRS. They ran the whole thing. It also appeared in another Soviet journal called New Times, not to be confused with the Euro-Communist Bilge program of 1991. But it's interesting, isn't it, that even New Times wasn't that new. It was the name of a fucking journal in Stalin's era. But it was reproduced in there, and the CPGB reproduced the New Times article in I think it was World News and Views, but I'd have to check that. World News and Views was the CPGB's weekly kind of roundup which was read by its members. The other part of the other evidence we've got is an August 1946 article in the Daily Herald. The Daily Herald was a kind of Labourite daily newspaper, which eventually in the 60s became the Sun of all fucking things. But anyway, the Daily Herald at that point was very much a Labour Party, kind of official daily news from the Labour Party. Very interesting read, actually. But in August 1946, there was an article where Stalin, which we also have the minutes of this meeting, where Stalin was talking with Harold Lasky, who was kind of the intellectual leader of the Labour left, and he was talking to a group of, he was talking to Phillips, I think, I can't remember what his role was, I've got it written down later. I'm going to talk about that article later, so we'll go through it. But basically, Stalin takes the British Labour Party delegation, says, yeah, there's a British road to socialism. This is in 46, remember. Takes them through this British road to socialism, and it's your road, it's the Labour Party, it's the peaceful road, the bloodless road, and you'll take longer to get to socialism than us, but you're on a good road. And that's the basically tone of the article. And the Daily Herald reproduced a big picture of Joseph Stalin, very much without the pipe, actually, but very much as a bushy head with a twinkle in his eye, Uncle Joe. Actually, Stalin didn't smoke a pipe, actually. That was somewhat of an affect. He smoked a pipe sometimes. It was a bit of an affectation. Stalin knew what he was doing. He wasn't stupid. He knew people like Stalin actually smoked cigarettes. I don't know what he smoked, Marlboro Lights, I don't know whatever, you know, they used smoking. So, other evidence we've got, CPGB General Secretary John Gollan briefly discussed Stalin's supervision of the British Road to Socialism in a 1964 Marxism Today article called Which Road, which was then made into a pamphlet, and not to be confused with That Which Road, which is quite a lot better actually than John Gollan's thing. But basically what John Gollan was actually doing is, at that point in 64, you had all these Maoist oppositions with a big thing in the CPGB till about the late 60s. There was a wave in the CPGB, and then there's a wave in the YCL. But so what Gollan did, and all these Maoists were marching around, and Stalin was and is a revolutionary icon to Maoist comrades. And so what John Gollan was doing was really giving them the two fingers and said, look, this document that you're denouncing as revisionism, as a betrayal of socialism and communism, it was done by your hero. He didn't linger long over it, but just long enough. And the CPGB at that point were doing quite a lot of research into far left groups, because they saw them, the Maoists, and to a lesser degree, perhaps the Trots, as kind of as competitors for their kind of prize. And so this was really him. And then in 1991, at the time of the Euro-Communist liquidation, George Matthews, who was the ex-assistant general secretary of the CP, I think, he discussed Stalin's role in overseeing the British road to socialism, kind of in the context of a load of probably one of the biggest non-stories of the 20th century, which was the story about so-called Moscow gold. Like, you know, who would have guessed that the CPGB were taking money from the Soviet Union? But it's completely mad. Who's doing that? You know, so this was a nonsense time story that was a load of bollocks. And it was bollocks anyway, because the money really wasn't that generous that was actually given, and it was used to pay stuff like Palm Dut's, Rajani Palm Dut's nursing costs. And there was some money given to the Morning Star, but it wasn't a fortune. And when I went round South Wales, just after the CPG's dissolution, and talked to old Welsh comrades, their attitude, which I think is a healthy attitude, was, well, I fucking wish we'd done some of that Moscow gold in our region, because we didn't have any fucking money, because basically the CPGB kept its branches in hot to the centre. That's kind of how it controlled them. But there was no fucking money in it. It didn't, you know, it wasn't much of a story, to be honest. But in the middle of that, George Matthews and Reuben Folber talked about this overseeing, and Reuben Folber just said, well, I don't have any regrets, which has kind of killed the story stone dead to some degree. I'm not a fan of George Matthews or Reuben Folber. I'm just facing to add on that point. So most sensible people on the left don't doubt that Stalin and the Russians had a big role in the British road to socialism. However, there is one young man called Harpal Bra, who also has an idea, like all other Maoists, that Joseph Stalin is the big revolutionary leader, and he's the big fighter against anti-revisionism. And Harpal Bra's group, a couple of years ago, they produced a pamphlet on the history of the British road to socialism, which amazingly didn't mention Joe Stalin's kind of role in it. And apparently, and I only know this by kind of osmosis, and Harpal Bra apparently has told his comrades that he thinks the documents are all forgeries, and the craft has been forged, and you know, all this kind of stuff. But I think this is silly. Excuse me. I think this is silly kind of politics, and it's not serious. And really, if those comrades don't think that Stalin had a role in the BRS, well, really the onus responsibility is on them to produce the evidence, because there's lots of evidence that suggests the kind of contrary. But if you see young CPGB, if I see young CPGB and ML members, it's always best, if you're going to engage in this, bring that up. Just try and bring that up. A couple of years ago, I was down on the May Day demonstration, and they were parading these big banners of Stalin. You just fucking go up to them and say, you know, you just stand there, look at it, and they'll come and ask you, and they'll say, "What are you doing? Why do you like Stalin?" I said, "Yeah, I'm just admiring the founder of British revisionism, comrades." And you can see it all goes quiet, and they tell you to fuck off. So yeah, so it's kind of fun, but you know. You have to make your own fun when you get to my age. So now, but there are I suppose there's two competing theories of the kind of genesis of the BRS. The first one is that, well, Stalin, he only put the icing on the cake, really, by discussing with Pollitt. All that Pollitt and Stalin did was just enshrine things that the British Party was already doing. And they'll always quote back at these people, they'll quote Harry Pollitt's Looking Ahead of 1947, which had a chapter called The British Road to Socialism, which is perfectly true, that document does exist. And various other policy statements produced during the war. There's a whole heap of them. And the CPGB was on this. It's perfectly true. The CPGB was on this kind of path to the BRS. And fundamentally, what it's trying to get at, and this was the theory of the old CPGB bureaucracy of the 50s and 60s, the Gollans, the McLennans, and the later, I don't know how we describe them, calling them centrists might be too generous, but they were kind of right centrist bureaucracies, the people that had always been at the centre of the organisation, and the ones that kind of ran it. But their idea really was that the British Road to Socialism is the product of a native British organisation, fully in line with the historic traditions of the British labour movement. And what this really expressed, I think, this is really that the whole, after the Khrushchev speech of '56, when Khrushchev had kind of half critiqued Stalin's role and the Cole's personality. The CPGB bureaucracy thought that this was all pretty toxic, all this. And so the very idea that somebody who'd been introduced in the mass media as a mass murderer, i.e. Stalin, the idea of you when you're trying to present yourself as like a British organisation, the idea that really your general secretary sat down at an extended meeting with Stalin, it was bad news, and they were very, very concerned with respectability and being seen as kind of an anchor of the British Labour movement. This whole idea didn't mean they dispensed with the BRS, because it went through various versions after that, but this idea, so it had to be changed, and that's why because lingering, anybody who thought about that, it undermines any idea of the so-called independence of the British Party, which is what they wanted to portray. That's kind of theory, that's the first broad theory. And the problem with the theory is very obvious. Why then did Pollitt and Stalin discuss it? Why did Pollitt have to get the imprimatur of Stalin for the? Why did Stalin think that the British road to socialism was suitable for use in the USA and all the British dominions? So that's what Stalin told Pollitt. Basically, this kind of line of argument, it always has to kind of explain away Stalin's role or underplay it when it was clearly there. The alternative theory is equally false, really. It's merely to load everything on Stalin's influence on Pollitt. You just see that kind of in isolation. Stalin's influence on Pollitt and the CPGB. But I think you kind of know where that's going to fall down straight away from what I've already said. As the problem with that theory then is it can't explain the CPGB's developing politics towards the Labour Party, and the fact really that the Communist Party's kind of softness on Labourism and its somewhat reliance on Labourism. This started like a long time ago. That started in the 1920s, never mind the 1940s or 1950s, and it started before Stalin had acceded to kind of power. So there is a longer route than just concentrating solely on a set of meetings and Stalin's influence in the 50s is slightly misleading, and I'll go through some of that. I think both perspectives tell you part of the truth, but they kind of what the problem with them is they exclude a kind of broader dialectic whereby Soviet politics and politicians mediated British reformism, and you also get the vice versa, and British forms also mediated Russian interjections. Indeed, I think it was like actually part of Stalin's art, and the why he was actually quite such a good in such a Machiavellian type of way. I'm talking good in a kind of very limited sense. I'm not saying Stalin was good, obviously. But basically, when Stalin talked to English audiences, he was able to actually anglicise himself and talk in the language for a British Labour movement audience. And the most obvious example of that is the Daily Herald article of August 1946, where Morgan Phillips, who was the Labour General Secretary at the time, so they have this delegation, and as I've said before, Stalin talked to the British advancing to socialism by a longer, more roundabout way. Your route is longer than our Russian route, which is much shorter. Our route is more bloody, and basically, he told the Labour delegation of course, that was manna from heaven to be told by Stalin, the leader of world socialism, that you're on the correct path. This is a Labour Party grouping, by the way, not a CP grouping. So, of course, he told them exactly what they wanted to hear, and he played up to them. And you can see that all through the interview, and they liked it, and because in general, Lasky in particular was sympathetic towards the Soviet Union. Lasky hated the CPGB, but in its own sphere, he thought the Soviet Union had a point, and generally backed their kind of foreign kind of policy. and their actions in their own kind of sphere. He thought they had a right to do that. So that was why that. The CPGB responded quite quickly to the Daily Herald article the next day in the Daily Worker. And what they said, this is 46, remember. And basically they said, well, you're not telling us anything that's new. We know Stalin thinks that, and we could have told you that. We could have told you that ourselves. You didn't need to go to Stalin. We were in favour of the British peaceful road to socialism. Is look at our policies, etc., etc. So they didn't duck it. But what I'm trying to get at is, this idea that, that Stalin was able, that was it. It wasn't just Stalin laying down like a law. He was actually able to work on the kind of players. And what it becomes clear, I think, from that whole thing with Stalin and the Herald is that the British road to socialism, really, in essence, was the CPGB writing the Labour Party's programme for it. Really, that's actually what it was. It was aimed at a Labour Party audience as well as a CPGB kind of audience. So, but we do need to avoid a reductive debate where you just get pushed around either one or the other. And really, I'm going to explore some of the kind of more broader roots of the BRS, which I don't think is often covered in the 20s, but mostly the 30s. But I'm going to, there's a book that was produced in 1929, and it was called Portrait of the Labour Party, and it was a guy called Wertheimer, and he was the London correspondent for Vorwärts, which was still the SPD paper, which was still in existence. So Wertheimer writes this portrait of the Labour Party, and it's a very interesting book, and you can find it online, and I'd recommend it, you reread it. Now, Wertheimer is obviously used, being from the continent, for a slightly more tense atmosphere between communists and social democrats than he actually finds in the Labour Party. He's obviously used to the split that's happened in Germany, and where things are a lot more angsty between the communists and social democrats. Because Wertheimer goes along to a few Labour conferences in the mid-1920s, the one in which when the CPGB is fighting against being turfed out of the Labour Party. And what amazes him, and he can't quite hide his amazement, given that these people are being turfed out, mostly the communists are being turfed out on the trade unionist bloc vote. It's not the rank and file vote for that. But what he finds is how popular people like Joe Vaughan and Harry Pollitt are on the Labour, because Pollitt used to go along, because Pollitt was part of the Boilermakers trade union. Joe Vaughan was an electrical trades union. So these pains in the arse, the Labour Party put with these pains in the arse, and there was lots of communist delegates who went as union delegates, and sometimes as before delegates to the local parties. And Wertheimer just says, whenever these people get up to speak, it's amazing. They've got the audience in the palm of their hands. And Joe Vaughan was a significant character in London, Bethnal Green. He'd been their mayor, the Labour mayor. But Pollitt also was, yes, Pollitt was somebody who was brought to the CPG leadership by Stalin, and he was a supporter of the Soviet Union, etc. But don't think that Pollitt was like a uncharismatic drone. He wasn't. He was a popular figure. I once listened to a Pollitt speech from the 1930s, and it was he was an incredibly good speaker. You can find YouTube clips of him. But the style reminded me, when I have listened to Arthur Scargill a little bit when I was in the SLP. It was the same type of style. Like, you start off, few jokes, take the piss out of himself. That was the good thing about Pollitt. That's why he wasn't a complete drone all the time, because he did actually have this kind of bantering kind of part to it. But he'd start off like Scargill used to, make a few jokes, have a joke with the chair, and then gradually you go slowly until you build up to the last 10 minutes and he's taken the fucking roof off. I've heard him doing a daily work of Benefit in the 30s. It's pretty good. It's in the British Library. It's not on YouTube. I've seen him, Michael Foot said about Pollitt during the Second Front campaigns in 1942. Everybody just wants to hear Pollitt. So he was a speaker. So you can see that there's this kind of, there was a real charisma. I mean, Pollitt was a real workers, a leader, despite the political. I'm not trying to eulogize Harry Pollitt from this, but we need to understand it. And we also have to remember that this was true in a lot of localities in the Labour Party as well. When the communists were excluded from the Labour Party, they took whole branches, they took whole areas with them, and sometimes often in certain areas where they were strong, they were in the majority, and it was the official Labour Party who were in the minority, and quite a lot of left-wing movement candidates, CP-backed candidates, defeated initially for a little while, defeated the official candidates, because these were like popular, rounded, kind of rooted individuals, actually also quite opportunist individuals in some cases, because they'd somewhat become acclimatized to the Labour Party. But there was a big influence. And it's actually interesting because obviously the Comintern in the late 20s went to an ultra-leftist kind of line, where the Labour Party was just another capitalist party, and then it was a social fascist party, blah, 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 blah. But actually, the actual Comintern advice to the CPGB, because I think the Comintern would have been very well aware of what Wertheim had seen. This is a place where these people have influence, much more influence than if they're outside as a kind of party on the kind of fringes of the Labour movement. So when Bukharin gives advice to CPGB members in December 1927, as part of his Comintern job, he was actually really hesitant, because at that time, by the end of 27, the Comintern's beginning to go into more ultra-left line. The actual advice Bukharin gives the British communists is, yes, you do have to stand against the Labour, scab Labour Party. He does say that, and we do need to have a more leftist line. But he actually says to them, they actually ask him questions like, well, what do we do then if we haven't got a left candidate to put against the official left candidate? Bukharin says, well, I don't want to give you a general rule. We've got to be careful, got to balance. And you can see that Bukharin was much more cautious about this kind of thing. But they're saying we've got X, Y, Z, and he says to them basically, you just, where you have influence, you need to retain, we don't want to just dissipate everything. Now, obviously that became much more unpopular when it became much more gung-ho, ultra-left in 29. But in early 1929, the CPGB folded the national left-wing movement up against Comintern advice. The Comintern actually wanted them to keep it going, because they said this, this is where you do have some influence. So the actual Comintern, even in the throes of a mad kind of ultra-left policy, was saying, hang on a minute, but that soon all got kind of swept away in the thing. But what actually happened during the third period is that John McIlroy brings this out in an article. I think it needs a bit more research than anything. CPGB, despite the ultra-left line, the ultra-left line that Labour Party is a scab, pro-imperialist, social fascist party, all through the third period, the CPGB kept its comrades inside the Labour Party, and that would have been, they would have been told to do that in certain areas. In certain areas, there was individual comrades, much less than there was before. Most of them have been turfed out, but they did keep comrades inside it. So, but if you look at it from the Comintern bureaucracy's viewpoint and the viewpoint of Stalin and the CPSU, as we move into the 30s, the CPSU and Stalin weren't interested in the British Revolution. They're not interested in world revolution or British Revolution. So then it becomes a matter of, well, where can we influence politics? Where have we got a mechanism to get a hook into British politics? How will we get Soviet politics broadcast in Parliament and in the Labour Party conference? How will we do that? Well, the obvious, you can tell the obvious is exactly what they did. So they then, under the instructions of the Comintern, quite early on, from about 34, 35, the CPGB started sending, in some cases, in some areas, up to 10 to 20% of its membership as secret hidden entries into the Labour Party to try and to do this exact kind of operation. And they took the politics of the Popular Front in the late 30s, they took that into which was basically, you know, an alliance with, you know, the democratic countries with the Soviet Union. Wasn't actually very popular in the Labour Party. It did have some adherents, Sir Stafford Cripps and Aneurin Bevan. They were in favour of the Popular Front. But in areas where the CP exercised control, and in many rural areas where CPGBs would join and dominate, would join and dominate Labour parties, you'd find the Popular Front, and you still had Popular Front messages and pro-Soviet messages were still being heard on the Labour Party conference floor till about 1940, and they did go beyond that as well. But we'll talk about that. Because basically, I'm not going to go into the story of it. The CPGB yanked out most of its entries in 1940, fairly unfortunately, and then it portrayed them to the world as new adherents to the CPGB, which in most cases was complete and utter bollocks. But most of these people have been recruited in and around the Labour Party for a number of years, and you can find classic accounts of this when the CPGB controller at the edge of the branch recruits everybody to the CPGB, and then after a couple of months he said, "Do you realise we're all communists? And this is a Labour Party ward meeting." It's all this entryist kind of operation. But they were all yanked out unceremoniously in 1940. But actually the CPGB's 1939 draft programme, which I recently produced a boring, overly long article for Cosmonaut on, the CPGB's 1939 draft programme, which was, just to explain about the draft programme, it was actually launched, this thing was actually launched, and they sold thousands of copies of it, and they did produce it in the Daily Worker. They produced every section of it in the Daily Worker. It was launched, but I think it was pretty much aborted during, because the conference it was meant to be held at was aborted, apparently because they couldn't get a hall. I don't know how true that is. I suspect the CPGB box didn't want a load more arguments, given they just had a load of internal aggro over the change warlike and anti-warlike that they got to. But anyway, you can actually see the beginnings of this kind of process in the draft programme of the CPGB beginning to write the Labour Left's programme for it. You can see the early part of that. So one section of the draft, the long-term part of the 1939 draft programme, it was an Earther type programme that talked of the struggle for a workers' democratic republic. And I think quite a lot of us who've looked at that and think, actually, fucking hell, this is not bad, actually, that part of it. But however, it was interlarded with an immediate programme, which actually the Daily Worker elaborated rather more on than they did the Earther kind of work. And this was an immediate programme of immediate demands to ameliorate kind of workers' demands. And the crown of that immediate programme was, you guessed it, a Labour government. This was very close. So you have almost in the draft programme, you have two competing conceptions. You have the old Earther type, workers' democratic republic, and a whole heap of democratic demands. The other type of the draft programme is just a straightforward shopping list of immediate demands crowned by a Labour government. So you can see the beginnings of this conception, like in 1939. The CPGB during the Second World, I've discussed, there was various policy statements that began to elaborate this idea of a peaceful revolution for a Labour government of a new type, began to appear. Also, the CPGB leadership had literally been quite enthusiastic supporters of Earl Browder's attempted liquidation of the USA Communist Party in 44-45, although it had backtracked on this when the French communists under the guidance of Dimitrov squashed it. So Lenin in 1944 was the headline of a palmed argument about enthusiastic about the Brown Statement. So they weren't keen on this, and that so there began to be this liquidation, this tame, until the French communists and the Soviets sat on that idea. And I'm not an expert on the CPUSA, but that was reformed anyway under Foster's leadership, I think, after the Second World War. So I think in some ways, the scene from the 1930s and the 1940s was really set for the adoption of the British road to socialism as we know it. So we've spoken about the utopian nature of the BRS and why it's never going to achieve socialism in Britain. But I think it's also important to realise that the British road to socialism was pretty much a dead duck as soon as when it was being conceived in 1950. And to get your head around that, the idea of a Labour left being strengthened by a phalanx of kind of communist MPs, that had partially, in a very minor way, kind of come to pass in the 1945 general election. The CPGB only won 2 seats, Willie Gallagher in Fife and Phil Pareton in Stepney. Pollock was really narrowly beaten in Rhondda East. And basically, but before the election, Pollock told people that their expectation was 6 MPs, 6 communist MPs. But as recounted in Douglas Hyde's I Believed, Douglas Hyde's I Believe was a kind of famous so-called expose of a defector to Catholicism. But actually, Douglas Hyde, who'd been worked at the Daily Worker and knew all the central leadership, actually, the weird thing about I Believe is that the Communist Party comes out of it pretty bloody well, actually, in some cases. So Douglas Hyde recounts how they were all laughing at CPGB headquarters when they saw the names of some of the Labour MPs come in, because it became obvious to the 8 to 9 were effectively people who followed the CPGB line and were kind of crypto communists. That was the name they got dubbed under. Examples would be Platts Mills in Islington North, and Pritt, Dennis Pritt. He stood in Hammersmith actually as an independent, being trounced the other candidate, and Dennis Pritt also. Pritt was a CPGB member in all but name only. He was a kind of lawyer. He used to write, nice books about explaining why the Moscow trials were fair and just and all that shit. So, but yeah. Also, there were other people around like Tony Ziliakis, who would also follow the Soviet line, but Ziliakis was a bit more independent. He fell out with the CPGB over Titoism, which I haven't got time to go into. You'd be glad to know. This harder group of basically communists or crypto-communists, they had an influence on the softer Labour lefts, particularly on issues of foreign policy. So the Soviet view of politics was being voiced in the Houses of Parliament after the Second World War. And much of the internal struggle in the Labour Party was Attlee trying to deal with this group, because Attlee didn't want that pro-Soviet voice being heard. However, as I say, this would all rapidly come into an end. Platts Mills was expelled in April 48, and a group of others, including Ziliakis, were expelled from the Labour Party after 6 of the MPs voted against the signing of the NATO treaty. This group had formed the Labour Independent Group, which was it was just a kind of like a name which they kind of met under. They were a kind of caucus. But these were all in the election of 1950, mostly because of the Cold War, which had happened at this point, and the Soviet Union suddenly become the enemy. Both the CPGB MPs were defeated. All of the Labour Independent Group were defeated, and those MPs, such as like the Liverpool MP Bessie Braddock, who would also, she would be a softer left, but she'd voice pro-Soviet Union stuff. She wasn't defeated, but these people were brought into line, and they were brought into line. and the CPGB's vote fell to an average of 2% in seats where it stood. That was more like 14 in 45. So this whole idea, the CPGB never had anything like that sort of impact in Parliament ever again. So you can kind of see that the reality, the partial reality, let's say, of this idea of like a phalanx of pro-communist MPs strengthening the Labour Party, that's disintegrated. It never happened again. And that's just at the moment that the BRS is being launched. So in some senses, the BRS is kind of, it's talking about a situation that's already not existed. And that was very common in CPGB literature. If you read Paratin's Our Flag Stays Red, he was also somebody who was pining for the old era of the 1930s when the CPGB could go out in the local community and not be tarred as a Cold War enemy. This is all looking back to a period that's actually kind of vanished. And so that's so the CPB really, in my view, was finished. The official CPG was finished as any kind of political force, and it went really, the organisation went into crisis after about 1956. What's time? It's
45 minutes.
45.
Okay, so I've got a bit more, so to carry on. We're getting through it, don't worry. Also, the conditions of its launching didn't help its popularity inside the CPGB. The actual conditions in which the BRS was launched. There was no special congress to decide this major departure. You don't need a special congress because it's already been agreed. And so it was introduced to members in branch discussions. There was a 1952 congress that was given the chance to rubber stamp it. That Pollitt moaned about that and said the debate on the British Road to Socialism was appalling at the Congress. Well, what do you expect? There wasn't a great deal of debate about the British Road to Socialism in the internal magazines of the CPGB. The left-wing opposition that had been in the CPGB in 45, which had been a big, strong, powerful voice inside it, that had ebbed away. Also as well, some communists didn't like it either. I haven't got time to go into this, but the 1951 British Road to Socialism kind of envisaged the continuation of the Commonwealth under a Labour government. Very unpopular amongst lots of CPGB members, and also Dutt didn't like it. So as soon as Stalin died, Stalin of course thought having a British Commonwealth as a counterbalance to the US, what a good idea. Labour government with its own, you can see Stalin's thinking, but Dutt having a constituency in India and places like that. As soon as Stalin's on the way, Dutt gets all that shat on in the 58 version takes that out. But very, very unpopular. They did sell apparently 200,000 copies of the BRS, but but importantly, the CPGB leadership didn't think it had a big impact on it. He thought Pollitt just said his impact was terrific but temporary. So yeah, just something that kind of came and went. Post its launch, 51, so the BRS went through British Road to Socialism, went through several different versions, 52, 58, 68 and 77, I believe. But fundamentally, they all advanced this basic idea of a Labour Party of a new type. There were some shifts and differences, which I don't have time to go through, but nothing fundamentally really changed in the kind of programme. And lots of people claimed that there were big changes, but they weren't. But I don't really have time to go into. So they were all reiterations of the 1951 version. In my view, they were changes of style, not really substance. And even though the 1977 version, its usage of an expanded kind of broader democratic alliance, which had already appeared as a concept, and its underlying commitment to the women's movement and anti-racist struggles, this really vexed the party's left. but they weren't big strategic changes in my view. The party's traditional right-centrist bureaucracy was fundamentally its thing was he was concerned to preserve its own power. It had a problematic relationship with BRS, partly because it was embarrassed that Stalin had overseen it, and I've said it wanted to present itself as an independent British party that wouldn't scare off Labour Party. The left of the CPGB always had a really uncomfortable relationship with the British road to socialism too. Okay, you're beginning to see now why the BRS was quite unpopular in some senses inside the BRS. There was a kind of underlying emotional stance, not really a rational stance, that the existence of the Soviet Union, established and built in a hostile pro-capitalist world through famine, civil war, and imperialist intervention, was somehow, by the very fact of its being in the world, like a standing indictment of the more run-of-the-mill reformism of the Labourism of the British road to socialism. Previous oppositions in the 40s that were led by Edward and Hilda Upward and Eric Heffer, who became a Labour MP, they thought that Stalin was on their side as revolutionary communists, and they didn't. They thought that they found it difficult to comprehend that Stalin was overseeing it. Heffer actually says they discussed sending people over to go and ask them. He said, look at what all these revisionist bastards are doing. You don't agree with this, do you? I think that meeting would have been quite comical if it had actually taken place. All of the party's left groups, and I'm talking about people I think I would class as subjective revolutionaries in some senses, they weren't reformists. All the party's left groups had illusions to some degree in the Soviet Union in the post-war period, although of course the Maoists disliked anything post-Stalin. Even groupings such as the Appeal Group, which was an opposition in the 1970s, it formally opposed and wrote articles it opposed the British road to socialism. This group fell to bits when its founder Eddie Jackson realised that somehow the Soviet Union under Brezhnev actually supported the British road to socialism. They found a Novosti article, and it actually Eddie Jackson, I think, was quite ill by this person. I mean, had some problems, and was getting very paranoid about infiltration. But he just disintegrated as a group, from what I've heard from members. But what you actually got with the CPGB's left was a lot of nudge, nudge, wink, wink type stuff. The BOS is a load of shit. We've got a different road that really relies upon armed force, tanks, and guns. The example I'm going to use was what Tom May, who used to formerly of this parish, he told me. Tom May told me that the BRS in his branch, which I think was John, will have to correct me if I do, but sorry, actually Aylesbury. He told me that but basically in his branch they treat the BRS as another horse shit that you just put out at election time. It's a kind of friendly kind of face. And as Tom put it in his inimitable way, you don't want to tell the bourgeois bastards that they'll all be up against the wall soon. So you have to put it somewhere. I presume from John's laughing that's accurate. Accurate. Sounds like Tom. But this is the kind of way it was thought about. It's just a useless piece of window dressing. We don't take it very seriously. But during the debate around the changes made to the British road to socialism, which sparked a huge debate in the CPGB, left-wing members who were involved in that debate around factions about the Surrey branch, which became the New Communist Party or part of the New Communist Party, straight left and others, stated that the 1977 draft was different to the 1951 draft. And they tried to claim that the party of the 1950s under Pollitt and Dutt was basically sound in its revolutionary credentials. I've never seen anything, I've never seen any evidence prove that. It was just a hunch and an inclination They're going to be good old boys. Pollitt and Dutt. They were the guys. And yeah, there's no way that they could be. But the implication of that, of course, is given that Pollitt and Dutt were creatures of Stalin's era, the implication of that is that Uncle Joe wouldn't have agreed with that either. But this is all kind of nudge, wink, wink stuff. The Leninist had a phrase for this, which was it's slightly clumsy, but it's quite good. It's kind of defeat today's revisionism, yesterday's revisionism. So you defeat, so you use something that's already revisionist to defeat something that's mature revisionism. And the first proper study of the British road to socialism's history was done by John and the Leninists in the 1980s. I think that was the first full, I'm not trying to blow smoke up John's arse or anything, but I think that from what I can see, the Maoists did do some really good critiques of it, but the first full breakdown, blow by blow, what happened, you won't find that from the CPGB's left. You wouldn't find it from St. French or anybody like that, or Fergus Nicholson of straight left. They never did it, and I'm nearly through with this. So before that, really, the left just had a series of half-baked ideas as to the BRS overseen by Stalin was basically okay. That was basically the kind of the idea. But it wasn't only the left that had this weird kind of relationship with it. It was the rest of the party, really, and certainly the party leadership. And it's actually really interesting to look at. Jimmy Reed was the CPGB trade union leader. He led the Upper Clydeside shipbuilders during their working, but he wasn't just a trade unionist who happened to have a CPGB badge. He was also part of the CPGB's political committee, and he was some ways was the public spokesperson. Jimmy Reed would be invited on Parkinson, main time TV, because he was a very good speaker. Very charismatic, very entertaining, very witty, and he's already quite a good example of the type of organic intellectuals, to use that term, that the CPGB would actually produce. His political ideas were half-baked, to say the least, but he was a public face of the CPGB, and he left in early 1976, and the British press were actually baffled at this. You can see in the newspaper articles at the time. Because what Jimmy Reed actually went to the press and said was, we've got this great program called the British Road to Socialism that I'm going to go round now I've left the CPGB, and recommend Scottish nationalists to the Labour Party. It's a great program for achieving socialism. Okay, but then they said, well, why did you let? This is what baffled, because I think the bourgeois press just expected to come out with some expose all wrong, but the bourgeois media work in those black and white terms. They don't like that ambiguity. And you can see the opinion writers getting really confused. Why is he still promoting their program when he's left the party? Well, what Jimmy Reed actually said is actually, he just said, well, this is an organization and a leadership that is incapable, but they only pay lip service to it. And he brought up a case. He said, how can they lead a democratic road to socialism, which I support, Jimmy Reed supports? How can they lead that? We had a debate on the political committee where Palm wrote a history of the internationals, and he was told by the political committee to remove all references to Harry Pollitt's opposition to the Soviet line during the Second World War. How can that be? And he talked in an article about how secretive it was, how kind of anti-democratic it kind of was. And he says they just pay lip service to it. They're not interested in principles. They're not interested in ideas. What they're interested in is actually managing the party. And Reed draws out about how conferences were like. Basically, when you go to conferences, if there's a new version of BRS, the leadership will put a job on and get everybody there to oppose the left. It becomes about management. It becomes not about principle. And you can actually see this if you watch the Decision British Communism documentary that was done by Granada TV on the 1977 Congress, where what actually happens at that Congress is that the left, the new Communist Party, flounced out. Surrey has taken their people with it, but the actual leadership was actually really quite worried by this, and they were actually having to. They were trying to pacify the left because they actually didn't, the leadership, because they didn't want their forces depleted, because they saw that, God, if all these people leave, we're going to be even more depleted. You know, we've got less of an organization. We've got that, you know, it's a threat to our control and existence. So what the leadership actually did, even though the left was defeated on the 1977 draft of the British Road to Socialism, all the left-wing amendments about the pro-Soviet amendments, etc., all defeated. But what the leadership actually did at the end of that Congress is that they introduced, to pacify the left, and much to the consternation of the Euro-communists at the time as well, they introduced this thing, which is basically not to be debated, but it's a straightforward congratulatory note to the Soviet Union on its 60th anniversary, and it's got quite a lot of like tropes of the CPGB left, you know, the thing. And there's certainly no mention of like Czechoslovakia in 1968, which the British leadership opposed. So it's purely opportunist, and they were trying to like. And what Reid has actually said there is that it shows how they were completely uninterested in principle, and the leadership also really had a go at the Euro-communist leadership of the YCL, because the YCL wanted to put out a statement in the Daily Worker that said people like John who'd left, we're glad they've gone. We're glad they've all gone. The CPG leadership trod on them and said, you're not putting that in. We're having to rely on people like this to rebuild our branches in Surrey, in Dorset, and in Hampshire, and in other areas where the NCP had taken people away from them. And so Reid says this, and Jimmy Reid's drank the British Road to Socialism Kool-Aid. You know, he's one of the few people who were like true believers in it. And there were some of them, and there were parts of the Euro-communists as well that believed in the 1977 Dane Cook would be a version. So, but you can see how this kind of thing is an operative, and it's kind of like a dead duck, really. It's like the CPGB. It was referring to a situation in history that had already passed, and then it was inside an organisation that just didn't work and that was incapable of fighting for any type of principle within it. I'm not going to shut up at that point.